Nice. So can we start out by talking about a little bit, why don't, since you're the challenger, can you tell us a little about who you are? You're on the county board, and you were the top vote getter.
Yeah, so I've got a quick 90-second intro to read for you
right.
guys. So my name is Rachel Ventura, and I'm a progressive Democrat, a mathematician, a naturalist, and a mother of twin girls. I work 2 jobs to make ends meet. After I was elected, I met with Congressman Foster on co-sponsoring the JPEL Medicare for All bill. He refused to sign on despite the constituents in his district having horrendous health care stories. So after researching Mr. Foster's voting record and campaign contributions, I learned that he was one of 12 Democrats who voted against the Americans with Disability Act. He voted with the Republicans to strip that down. Several environmental groups have met with Mr. Foster on the Green New Deal, another bill that he refuses to sign on to. And as a lifelong environmentalist and someone who has a strong environmental record on the Will County Board, I was pretty outraged. There's some big differences between Foster and I, which I'm sure we'll get into. My congressional campaign is modeled after my successful race in 2018, where I was outspent 3-1, and I still beat the Democrat by 11 percentage points and the Republican by 8 percentage points. My team so far has knocked on 10,000 doors. We gathered twice as many signatures as Foster, and with 1,100 Ventura signs in the district, it's a strong signaling that the district is ready for new representation. So I'm not taking any corporate PAC dollars, and I've signed the No Fossil Fuel Money Pledge. My opponent cannot say the same. With 40% of Congress as multimillionaires, Foster's the 34th richest person in Congress, and I believe he's out of touch with the district's needs. So we need true representation, and I will continue to be a strong voice for the residents in my district.
Okay. Well, Congressman, why don't you do the same, then we'll go with some.
Oh, sure. Well, look, I spent most of my career as a scientist, and that's really basically who I am. I've worked at Fermilab for 23 years. And in Congress, I've been a strong vote for logic and rational response to the very complex issues that we face. I'm chairing a task force in financial services on the impact of artificial intelligence, both on financial services and our wider economy, which I think is one of the things that's one of the most important issues that is already starting to get us. I think it's driving what's both the Bernie thing and the Trump thing ultimately that you saw. You see rural America was basically being eviscerated by the automation of agriculture and the reduction in the number of farmers and farm towns.
And that's related to AI?
Yeah, it's related to automation generally.
Right, automation
the difference with
generally.
AI is now it's going to be going after a very large number of jobs. We saw, you can see in financial services, when you talk to the CEOs of large banks, they all have plans to eliminate order of half their workforce or more by replacing highly paid jobs with AI. So it is going upscale. It is not just the factory workers and the farmers and the.
And what have you done on that issue?
Well, I've been a leader on it for a while. A member of the New Dems, which are sort of business-focused, moderate Democrats, and we've had task forces on this. Part of this is to reduce the friction in the gig economy. Part of it is to get more workforce retraining, because one of the effects of the turbulence caused by technological job displacement is going to be that people are going to be at specific jobs for smaller periods of time than they were at the past. So we're going to have to see education as a lifelong project, and so that's part of the answer. Part of the answer is to just make sure that the young kids especially have a strong STEM background, and so I've gone to a large number of STEM STEM events and sponsored STEM events in the district, trying to get young kids to not be afraid of STEM and see it as an essential part of their future. So that's again only part of the problem, but we have to have an understanding that we're all in this together, that it's not just newspapermen and everyone else that's threatened by technology. It's a very broad thing, and we're going to have to respond to that. Among other things, we're going to have to think seriously about the structure of our economy. There's a danger that artificial intelligence is going to pile on to the already very strong danger of monopolies in our any purely technological firm is a natural monopoly. And so and that doesn't mean that they're necessarily evil. They just, if you probably the first one we saw was Microsoft Word, and because no one wants to. Well, it's driven. The monopoly there is driven by two things. The first thing that people, no one wants to own an incompatible word processor, and the second thing is that it costs Bill Gates almost nothing to add an additional customer to Microsoft Word, whereas it costs a competitor, $1 billion before they can sell their first copy. And so this doesn't mean that, that these natural monopolies are intrinsically evil, but there are huge threats of things like, small businesses are terrified of what Amazon is about to do to them or is
And
already
so what do you do about
doing
that?
them.
If the
Well,
new-
I think that we have to make sure that our anti-monopoly laws that exist are enforced. And I think that over time, we're going to have to see, treat them, there are a lot of lessons we learned with the railroads, and that we eventually had to treat railroads as common carriers. That we learned the lesson that you can have businesses operate a railroad, or they can be a meat packer or a manufacturer, but they cannot be both. Or the monopoly, the natural monopoly of a railroad, between two cities, there's a natural monopoly. That will drive, that monopoly can be leveraged to take over the meatpacking
So let
industry.
me ask you, when we do endorsements, the most basic thing we do, if we endorse an incumbent, is we say, this congressman or state senator or whatever, that in the last 2 years, they have done this, this, and this.
Yeah,
Can you
sure.
fill in that blank?
Yeah, all right, well, the House has more than 400 pieces of legislation. I won't go through the whole list, but the things that I think are
Ones that
significant.
you've sponsored, where you've been the lead, where you, more than
Yeah,
anybody
okay,
else.
so for example, the most important priorities I see for my district are, the opioid crisis is huge, getting
Mhm.
infrastructure spending.
Right.
Appropriate infrastructure spending is huge, and immigration reform, where I can't claim that we've made a lot of progress on immigration reform. On the opioid thing, I'm actually been very proud of what we've done in trying to get medically assisted treatment. This is one of the things that has become clear through federally funded research, that there's a huge difference in the effectiveness of treatment of opioid addicts if you add medically assisted treatment to social support. Social support by itself is almost totally ineffective. It's, a good social support treatment has a single-digit percentage probability of curing an addict. If you add medically assisted treatment, then it goes over 50%.
So what do you?
And so I sponsored amendments to add funding and to direct HHS to prioritize treatment that includes medically assisted treatment. Also, another very high leverage thing is federal research into pain treatments that do not involve opioids. There's a lot of really interesting, and also the actual mechanisms of opioid addiction. Actually, at Argonne National Lab in my district, there's fascinating research where they are using the giant particle accelerator there to directly image the molecules that are involved in the response of the brain to opioids, these so-called G-coupled protein receptors. And so that will give the possibility of drugs that combat and block
Pain
the
without
opioids.
the opioids.
Yeah, in fact, and one of the most
effective.
effective medically assisted treatments is Vivitrol. It's basically a shot in the butt once a month that you get, and for the next month, you can take opioids, including fentanyl, and feel nothing. And this is transformative. And different states are, for example, just giving it to patients as they leave jail. When you get out of jail, if you got into jail because of an opioid addiction, if you get one of these shots, then for the first month that you're free, they will very often try opioids again, but feel nothing.
And once again, your involvement in this has been what?
Has been to steer federal funds into this. We just had an announcement of $1.2 million of medically assisted treatment funding that arrived in DuPage County. You can see the press release on that.
So those two things, the research into
Yeah.
pain treatment that doesn't involve opioids, the story of our funds into those avenues, and also medical assisted treatment for opioid, people who have opioid
Right,
problems.
yeah.
It's not
The
just
infrastructure
treatment.
stuff is, one of the
We're
big
fighting for
issues.
that.
Yeah, right. So those are, those are, the two biggest. Oh, the third thing is the ban on a unique patient identifier.
I saw that in your
Yeah,
questionnaire.
for the last 23 years, it has been illegal for manufacturers of electronic health records to have a unique patient identifier that works across all the different things. And that is killing tens of thousands of Americans a year. Some estimates are above 100,000 a year through preventable medical mistakes. When you go to a new clinic, you have to go and fill out all these forms of when did you have measles and mumps and when was your last vaccination, and then you go to a different clinic. The reason is that you don't have what we have in other countries, where you say, here's my medical
Why
ID.
don't we have that?
Because it's been illegal for the last
I know,
23
but why
years.
has it been illegal?
Ron Paul, 23 years ago, proposed and got adopted by the House and Senate, an appropriation rider that made it illegal for the electronic health record makers to get together and get a unique identifier.
And the reason for that was?
Well, you have to
It's a privacy
psychoanalyze.
issue.
I believe it's a privacy issue that, maybe you can imagine that Ron Paul wanted to be able to go into the next county and get Viagra without his
So
doctor
I guess the
finding
question
out,
is that not a legitimate concern that this?
Well, I think, this is all
identification
HIPAA-protected information. This is HIPAA-protected information, so there should, in principle, be no private.
Right.
But, the thing about this, and the reason why I was able to get a Republican partner and repeal this ban, at least in the House, was that this was a big enabler of the opioid epidemic. That one of the big things, it was doctor shopping for opioids.
Right.
That people would come, even like high school kid would get a sprained ankle, get addicted to opioids, and then head down the wrong path.
But there's an easy solution to this, and it's not the bill that you're talking about. It's Medicare for all. I mean, we have TRICARE today. Military families are on it. The recent retired militaries are on it, and they all have a unique identifier. The government not only runs that program, they set the prices for pharmaceutical companies. They set it for doctors and hospitals, what they can pay. They can't then overcharge those patients, based on the rates that those doctors and hospitals have already agreed to. This is the savings that Medicare for All is modeled after. In the Medicare for All
but
bill,
back
it
to-
has it in
so
there.
I just want to make sure. So are you finished with that point about the
Yeah, so it's an example of something that's actually achievable.
Okay.
I'm a big fan of step-by-step improvements that are politically achievable instead of, a deep pass that's likely to fall
And your
incomplete.
point is that if you have Medicare for all, that
Then
resolves
everyone would
these
already,
issues.
yes, it would resolve that issue because you would have a giant database of everyone on there. So you wouldn't have to do away first with the ban of unique patient identification. Everybody would have a unique patient identifier, and doctors would be able to speak to each other. They would be able to see those records.
I can anticipate the argument in favor of Medicare for all because I've heard it. I've heard it from Elizabeth Warren and from Bernie Sanders. And I know the argument against it. And the argument against it, which we hear a lot, is that frankly an awful lot of people like the health insurance they have right now. And
And-
realistic, in the real world we live in, Medicare for all simply doesn't have the public support it needs. Bernie Sanders is asked about that, and he goes, well, I don't need to work with Republicans. I'll go out on the hustings and I will campaign for this, and the people will crowd around me, and that will get it done.
Well,
I don't believe that.
I don't look at it like that. So I look at it the fact that we're not trying to take anything away from someone. What we're trying to do is give everybody else the same Cadillac plan that they have. So when you open that up for everybody to have the same care, it's not that they love their insurance companies, it's love that they have the health care they need. They have doctors that they can go to that they can choose. They like the choice of it. But in reality, they don't have a lot of choice. Insurance dictates the care. I used to be an actuary and I worked for the insurance companies, and we set premiums and we shut down hospitals based on whether or not they were in network or not out of network. It is the insurance companies who ultimately have the ability to dictate care for individuals. And we see that in the almost 40,000 deaths each year of people who are denied care. We had a Medicare forum in our area, and a participant there told a story about her family member who had gone to the doctor, had a hernia, they suggested surgery, the insurance companies denied it. He went home, had multiple denials by the insurance company. One day when he started to bleed at work, he went home and tried to stop the bleeding with towels and sheets, and he bled out. They found him 2 days later dead in his apartment. This is the healthcare for-profit industry that we have today that dictates care. So it's not that we're trying to take away people's insurance, it's trying to make sure that everybody has access access to health care, and that it's affordable, and that people can have the quality of life they deserve. Because even people who have insurance don't go to the doctor because they can't afford it. I myself was a person who went 2 years without insurance, which is one reason I went and spoke to Foster about Medicare for All, because I know the TRICARE system exists and millions of Americans are on it today. It's already working. We pay for it. And then in order to open that up for everybody else to have a better system of Medicare for All, not one that makes people pay gap insurance and supplemental insurance, that is something that Congress is allowed to roll back the protections on Medicare for All. And so if we expand and improve it, not only will people get the care they need, but they'll be able to have eye and dental and all these things that are inner workings that affect our health. And so the way I look at it is it's not that we're taking something away, it's that we're offering it to everybody. And if it's care, a true choice of doctors, then the only way to have true choice of doctors is to have every doctor and hospital in the system. And then what's dictating that is your choice to go to that doctor.
What do you think about Medicare for All then?
Well, I think, first off, that access to a basic level of health care is a basic human right, and that is the direction we should move for. But we have to do it, if you want to accomplish it in our lifetime, in a series of achievable steps. What I'm very worried about, for example, is that we'll nationally get into the situation we got into in Vermont, where they passed single-payer health care with the sort of very generous benefits that Rachel talks about. And then when they actually did the calculation of how much it would cost and what the tax increase associated with that would be, they repealed it. And it ended up being a huge black eye for the whole enterprise of trying to get health care for every American, because they didn't look at the true cost of this before they passed something. So I think that's a very important principle with me. There are a number of levers that we have today that could step by step do a lot toward covering, moving toward universal health care. One of the things we can do is to continue the Affordable Care Act. First off, we have to protect the Affordable Care Act. One of the reasons I returned to Congress after losing in the Tea Party wave after voting for the Affordable Care Act was that I thought we had to protect it. And so even when you protect it, we should also continue, for example, its expansion of Medicaid, which is the true safety net. If you're young and invincible, and then all of a sudden you get cancer, can't hold down a job, Medicaid is the safety net that catches you. I think we should expand Medicaid, continue the ACA's expansion of Medicaid. I think over time we should eliminate the means testing so it becomes a universal safety net that doesn't only apply after you've lost your house and everything else. And so we can strengthen Medicaid. I think for seniors, we should do things like passing HR 3, which is the lowering the drug costs, and then over time lower the age of Medicare. That's sort of a continual incremental process where I think you could hope to get bipartisan support because most people get into most medical problems after they're 50 and before they're 65, and so that lowering that would help a large number of people. Without any increase of taxes, you could allow people to buy into Medicare at cost to the taxpayer. And some calculation indicates you could provide a better insurance plan than you can buy in the Obamacare exchanges that would allow Medicare. And then finally, a public option, which is something I have voted for as long as I've been in Congress. The House-passed version of the Affordable Care Act had a public option. This would provide a not-for-profit version of insurance, government-run. And, very much as Mayor Pete very eloquently points out, that the way to convince people that a government-run system is better is to provide a government-run product, a public option that is, because it doesn't rely on the profit motive, would actually provide a better product. And then people would just say, I can get a better deal with the public option than I can in the for-profit insurance business. Use that as a step.
But it strikes me that in many ways, we've had this conversation a million times now between people who are more the moderate kind of Democrat and a whole new kind of Democrat, including my son, who are very impatient and they want to bring wholesale change. But it comes down to, in many ways, a disagreement about means, about how to get from A to B.
Mm-hmm.
And
so what I hear...
I guess the question is, where are the votes? if you don't have the votes, then what's the point of putting someone in Congress who
So
won't
I had
advocate
two
for
polls
something?
in my write-up that indicated that 70% of Americans do agree with a Medicare for All single-payer type system. I'm happy to provide the links to those polls after this interview. But what you hear Mr. Foster talking about is profit, right? So what we can't afford is loss of human life. And to kind of bring it back to some of these other points, you know, when he says the most important issue is AI, no, it's not. It's the wealth gap, and people are struggling day in and day out. We've got over
That's not what I
99
said.
tipping
I said that was
agencies,
an-
and I let you talk, Foster, for a
amplifier.
long time.
I said
It would
it
be
was an
nice if you didn't
amplifier for
interrupt
wealth.
me as well. So we have 99 tip agencies in Joliet. We have a prison population that's coming out, and we have undocumented workers in our backyards. And these people are being exploited by company after company, by these warehouses. Amazon got $29 million in tax abatements over the last 10 years from Joliet alone. And so we have workers who have wage theft through their temp agencies. We have people who are not making living wages, people who are making under the minimum wage. The people who live in the shadows because of our policies. So things like immigration reform and criminal justice reform are absolutely needed so people can be a part of the society, can make a living wage, and then we need to index that living wage to inflation. So as the amount goes up, we don't have this fight every couple of years. So where are the votes? The votes are in the people, and you can see that by driving through our district when you see people are suffering, whether it's through healthcare, whether it's through low-paying jobs, and the number one crisis in the world right now is climate change. And as a scientist, you should be embarrassed that you did not know that from the get-go. So right off the bat, I would say something like the Green New Deal is absolutely needed, because not only does it close the wealth gap, it provides healthcare, it puts people back to work, and you know what it stops doing is it stops putting money in the people who cause the problems. The two things you talked about here is the opioid and the Argonne's research. Those both benefit big pharma. I pushed hard to have marijuana in Will County because it allows people to, one, take control of their pain management other than opioids. Two, Will County and the state of Illinois have been going after pharmaceutical companies to sue them and hold them accountable for making people addicted to these drugs that they knew were addictive. They put children who broke their arms on Vicodin and got them early started addicted to these medicines. That's ridiculous. And then the rest of their life is ruined. And then, yeah, they end up in the prisons in Joliet. And then when they get out, they have a life sentence because nobody wants to seal their records. So employers don't hire them. Landlords don't rent to them. And we have a huge homeless population in our backyard. And I do work on the continuum of care boards, and I do work on the housing boards. And the things that I fought for are the people and treating them with dignity and respect. So that's our biggest crisis.
So let's go to the issue of climate change. I'm trying to understand if your outrage is properly directed toward the incumbent Democrat, or whether or not it should be directed toward Republicans who are
He's been in
denying.
office for 10 years. He reminds us on his literature every single year that he's a business. He reminds us on his literature every year that he's a scientist and a businessman. Yet he has not presented bills that would actually tackle the climate crisis. And the bills he supports now are fossil fuel bailout bills. It is meant to give the money, our taxpayer dollars, to the fossil fuel industries. So yeah, as a scientist,
The
he should
bills
be.
would do what with the fossil fuel industry?
Would
What
give-
do those bills do?
So there's a couple bills that he's sponsoring. One of them is the Use It Act, and it provides taxpayer dollars to the fossil fuel industry to continue something called EOR, Enhanced Oil Recovery. So what they plan to do is use our dollars on the Use It Act to create pipelines that will then try to capture the carbon coming off of these fossil fuel industries and inject it into the ground, much like fracking, to push out the dirtiest oil, which then we have to use more energy to clean that oil because there's residuals and stuff, and then they're going to continue to use that oil in your car. So you're going to be burning you're going to be burning that carbon and putting it back in the atmosphere. So instead of our taxpayer dollars going towards renewable energy, they're going to be pushing it towards the fossil fuel industry continue to get tax breaks. So there's a couple bills that he voted for. The
Well, let's
Future
talk
Act is
about
one
that.
of them.
Yeah,
Let's
could-
do
could
two things.
say-
One is, it's unfair to allow you to set the agenda, the whole
Sure.
conversation.
No, go right ahead.
So I gotta make sure the congressman also
Right.
gets to.
First,
bring up issues.
specifically on
But
the
will you
Use It
address
Act,
the specific-
endorsed by Tammy Duckworth and Dick Durbin, so she can have that argument with them. It provides federal research money and some project demonstration money for sequestering carbon dioxide. there are going to be many industries, like brewing beer, making cement, that will emit carbon dioxide. You have your choice of venting that directly in the atmosphere or finding ways to geologically sequester it. Now, for example, in most of the United States, there are deep saline aquifers, and if you take carbon dioxide that you'd otherwise vent to the atmosphere, inject it in deep saline aquifers, it gets geologically sequestered permanently. All right, and so no one really understands the economics of doing that, but I think that part of the solution, it's not a full solution, but part of the solution for the carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere is to take unavoidable industrial sources of carbon dioxide and find some way to inject them. It doesn't have a ban on this, but this is not the focus of the bill. The focus of the bill is finding large numbers of ways and doing research into ways to sequester carbon dioxide.
That's just not true. This is the creator of the bill, Barrasso. I've highlighted here, we can use carbon dioxide to extract oil from wells that wouldn't otherwise be profitable through the process called enhanced oil recovery.
Right, that is one of the many
Unavoidable?
possible uses of this. One of the many possible uses. As I can say, in realistic bills are compromises, particularly if you want to get them passed in the Senate. The benefit to our to our world from having ways to economically sequester carbon dioxide are huge, and that's part of it.
But this is my last
yeah, if I
question,
could
because I
back
haven't
up,
allowed Lorraine to talk or leave it. My last question, the general criticism is that you're focused on issues that arguably are not the most pressing issues facing our country right now, that AI, automation, these kinds of issues.
No, well,
Your
look
opponent
at
would
it.
argue that you should be worried about income inequality.
Oh, look at, I'm a big supporter and have voted for
You're
it. Just
supportive,
last
but
week,
you're not a
last week
leader
I
on the issues,
voted.
she would argue.
I don't want, if there's not a problem with my voting record, just last week, we voted to increase tax rates on the wealthy to repeal the salt tax. That was one of the worst things, directly targeting states like Illinois. All right, and so, the first thing I ever did in politics was to join an effort in Illinois fighting the repeal of the estate tax, which is one of the fundamental tools that we have, a wealth tax. A wealth tax on the children of the very rich, and the idea that we repeal that. That was the first thing I ever did. Ralph Martyr, who you probably know, more than a decade ago. And so this is a big deal. When I started my business back when I was 19, I knew that that if our business ever became successful, as it did eventually, I would be paying 85% top marginal tax rates, and that did not stop me from being from staying up all night to get our first products out the door.
But we don't
All
pay that today.
And we don't pay that today, and that's where we should go back. We should go back to the deal that when I was young, the deal that we had, the deal we should return to. I paid about $2,500 a year, either a year or a semester, I'm not sure, for tuition at the University of Wisconsin, okay, and which I was able to pay with a part-time job and a summer job, okay, and in return for that, I got a very good education, started the business, and Wisconsin has gotten back its investment many times over because our company has worked well and provides over 1,300 jobs, good paying jobs with good pay and good benefits. And so this is the deal that we should return to, that if you become successful in this country, that you're expected to pay your fair share and a big part of that is to raise top marginal tax rates.
Then why didn't you sign on to Chris Van Halen's bill from Maryland, the Millionaire the Surtax Act? It's 10% increase on every dollar over $2 million. It's HR Bill 5043. Jan Schakowsky was a co-sponsor. You were not.
There are a large number of bills. My staff has to focus on things that have a large chance of getting a floor vote.
Yeah, you talked about, what you have done or what you support as opposed to Medicare for all.
Yeah.
What is your, number one, what's your issue with the Green New Deal, and what would you do
Well, first off,
instead?
I support the 100% Clean Economy Act, which has its target of being net neutral carbon emissions by 2050, and is focused particularly on research and development, getting a coherent plan, led by the federal government, to actually to perform the research and come up with a plan so that we decarbonize not only the U.S. economy, but provide the cost reduction technologies so the rest of the world can decarbonize. There is enough money in our country to decarbonize our economy. You know, the estimates are single-digit trillions of dollars to decarbonize our economy. Just for reference, during the Obama recovery, the wealth of Americans has gone up by about $50 trillion. So there's enough money to do that. But if we do that by forcing the early deployment of very expensive renewable technologies, then that does not provide a pathway for the rest of the world. India, 95% of the population of the world cannot afford that level of investment. So that if you look back 50 years from now and say, how did we solve this problem? It will be by providing the cost reduction research. An example of that, in the next couple of years, electric cars are going to pass gas cars for the total cost of ownership. It's going to be cheaper to do them. That is because of decades of federally funded research into batteries. People have known for decades that everything else about an electric car is cheaper than a gas car. It's got about half the number of moving parts in an electric car than a gas car. And the battery was hellishly expensive and had poor performance. If we had made the mistake 10 years ago of forcing everyone to buy electric cars with the technology of 10 years ago, you would have had these lead acid batteries, things with 70-mile ranges, and the battery would die after 50 discharges, and it would have been a disaster. Instead, what we did is we continued to make big investments in battery technology, including at Argonne. In the electric cars of today, the cathode is something developed at Argonne National Labs because of decades of research into batteries. And now that batteries, the technology has evolved to the point where an electric car is now cheaper than a gas car, we will soon not have to be arguing about CAFE mileage standards and all that sort of stuff, because no one's going to want to buy. And that's an example of the difference between forcing people to buy technologies before they're economically feasible and doing the research to lower the cost in zero carbon technologies. And another thing that I'm doing in Congress today is what's called the BEST Act. This is something that does demonstration projects for grid level energy storage. One of the things that limits the penetration of renewable energy into our grid today is the fact that the wind doesn't blow all the time and the sun doesn't shine all the time.
Hydropower.
So you need energy storage. Yeah, and that we've used up all of the available hydropower sites that can be done without economic damage in our country.
True.
And so that the missing piece in getting high penetration of renewables, a big missing piece is energy storage. The Best Energy Act, which I'm the sponsor in the House, the Senate side sponsor is Senator Susan Collins. So this is an example of a realistic thing that might actually pass even in this divided economy, because
What House bill is that?
I will dig it up. I may have cited it.
I'd just like to look it up and read up on it.
Yeah, it's the
Best
better energy storage technology.
Oh,
Yeah, so it's Collins in the Senate. I'm a primary co-sponsor in the House. And so this does, among other, the big thing it does is demonstration projects and technology development for grid level energy storage. So these are energy storage at the base of a wind farm, energy storage in neighborhoods, so that you can flatten out the demand, the mismatch between supply and demand of renewables and the variable. And so making what I'm hoping for is we'll have the same sort of home run that we saw with Tesla. Tesla exists because something I voted for, which was a stimulus loan that went, I think, $500 million that enabled Tesla to start up. At that point, they realized that battery technology was such there was a decent chance of proving that electric cars were feasible and affordable and workable. And so the government made a bet on Tesla that's paid off massively. And so it's my belief that energy storage technologies at the grid level are probably to that point where government subsidized demonstration programs can make it clear, not only to our industry, but to countries around the world, that a combination of renewables and affordable grid level energy storage. So that's just something I'm doing.
Well, the Clean Economy bill is very misleading. In the bill, I've highlighted it for you. It says they are trying to bring it to an economy-wide net zero greenhouse gas emissions or negative greenhouse gas emissions after annual accounting for sources of sinks of anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions. The picture you have in front of you is what they're talking about. They're talking about making a net zero accrual sheet that will allow for net zero. In the bill, it's vaguely stated it will create a plan. They'll have a table, everyone gets a seat at the table, it defines who will be at the table, and then it has EPA standards of looking at that in 6 months, 9 months, 15 months. It does not put in there that they'll be removing to renewable energy. It does not say anything about electric vehicles. It doesn't talk about the transportation needs we need to move into. The Green New Deal dictates all of those. It talks about, it is the blueprint of where we need to go in this country, both from a wealth standpoint, from the climate crisis, from the infrastructure needs that we have, from the jobs that we need to be creating. It's very detailed. For him to say that, this is realistic and actually will pass. No, what this is a political bailout for the fossil fuel industry. And we need political people in office who are going to fight for what we actually need, and that is closing the wealth gap.
Well, a couple. Incidentally, the Senate, I guess, is ready to start the impeachment trial this hour against the president. And both of you talk a bit about Trump and his administration in your questionnaire. One is, Congressman, you mentioned that you believe he did abuse his power, and you kind of talked about the parameters under which he could be impeached. My question for you, A, is, are the offenses ongoing, and do you see coming out of the House another vote for impeachment out of the House? That's one. And two, for Rachel, you believe that the impeachment, the focus was too narrow, that you should look at the emoluments and other things. So, I hate to double barrel you, but
Sure.
the question when I can, starting with you, Congressman, do you see,
Yeah, no, first off, to your question, is it ongoing? The answer is yes. He is not, one of the most dangerous things he's done to our democracy is his blanket refusal to respond to Senate and House requests for information and for witnesses. This is different than even what Richard Nixon did. Richard Nixon allowed, his chief of staff and produced many documents. I think Clinton produced over 1,000 and maybe thousands of pages of documents responding to requests. Trump has provided zero, and not only in response to impeachment inquiries, but I serve on House Financial Services. We're looking into the whole Deutsche Bank issues and related there, and we've gotten zero response from the Trump administration on that. And this is very dangerous if you decide that you're going to move to a model where the president can do anything he wants and then ignore House requests for oversight. This was a fundamental part of our checks and balances. And I think that, to my mind, unquestionably, the most important single count of impeachment is actually the second one, where he is stonewalled. That cannot be allowed to stand. And I can't understand why any senator would decide that that is something they can shrug off. We'll see.
What does the House do? I mean, if there's a pattern of stonewalling, what do you do?
Look, the ultimate answer is in the polls. If we don't get an answer out of the Senate, every senator who votes to not consider that has two problems to face. The first one is if there's a Democratic president, they can expect to have their subpoenas ignored. And they have to think that through if they're going to support Mitch McConnell in this. And the other one is just answering to the American public. If they decide that a trial is not necessary, witnesses are not necessary, and so on. There are a large number of other abusive offices, things like the emolument clause and so on, that could have been. There was a decision in order to get a strong vote from the entire, at least the Democrats in the House, that to focus on the two narrow, clear things, the Ukraine and the...
Isn't there a court, just a quick, because isn't there a court case pending about those?
Oh yeah, Deutsche Bank and so on. Oh yeah,
okay.
Right.
All
And
right.
it looks like, well, look, we've been struggling with
get
that
too
on
into
financial
that.
services. they have been delaying as much as possible, trying to fight in the courts. It looks like with all the maximum delaying tactics, sometime around May, we should finally get our hands on the Trump Organization's business records and implicitly tax records. And that's another thing that senators have to worry about, is that if they vote that this guy is, he's just fine, everything is perfect, and then look at the things that at least Michael Cohen has indicated are there. Michael Cohen's in jail today for things that he did, at the direction of individual one. All right.
So he just led into the why I believe it's too narrow. I mean, there was obstruction of justice. They did not look at the Mueller report. The emoluments clause, they violated 1 month in office. The multiple cases of abuse of power. I mean, they impeached Clinton for lies. Let's talk about the multiple lies that Trump has put out there, ignoring Congress on some of the war efforts, the Ukraine, obviously that was a part of it. But here's the reality is Foster voted 4 times against impeachment hearings. If we want to hold our elected officials accountable, it starts at the top. It starts at the local level. It
Stop
starts
right there. Did you vote 4 times against impeachment hearings?
There were a number of, from very quickly after Trump was, I don't know if 4 is the right number, but there were some what I regard as premature, straight out of the gate requests to impeach Trump.
I'll send you the
that I
4
did.
votes.
Early on.
Very early on, but once it triggered,
Do you think there's an argument that says that maybe early on a lot of reasonable people didn't think it was time?
Your last vote against it was in April of last year. How is that early on? Well, I can send you the
Here's
dates.
the larger argument. The larger argument, and frankly these are related, the larger argument is that if you rope everything into an impeachment indictment, what you're really doing, being in charge, what you're really doing is you're making it so many issues that you start peeling away Americans who actually think that's not enough. I don't care for that foreign policy decision, but that's not a reason for impeachment. The reason they focus so strongly, and these are, Adam Schiff and Pelosi, people who are rather focused, the reason is because they wanted to have one clear, understandable thing that Trump did, that the American people could completely be outraged by and understand. And this Ukraine thing was exactly that. I remember at the time thinking, because I went through the same process as you, where do you stop? The guy's a disaster from day one. And I understand that impeachment, you have to pull people with you.
Mm-hmm.
If you don't have public support for this, then you're lost. And
Even after the Mueller report, though, he voted no.
Was to try to pull public support, not
Right. So, and here's the deal: is after it became politically popular and Foster came out for impeachment, he was then in backroom dealings with Democratic parties, cautioning against the ramifications of Biden if we were to move forward, that we must slow down and think political of what this will look like. How is that holding people accountable? I understand what you're saying, that you don't want to create a bigger divide there, but the multiple things that we have here, there could have been investigations on the emoluments clause. There could have been in hearings on the abuse of power. And he did vote no after the Mueller report came out.
Investigations into this Deutsche Bank thing, which you don't know that could be a really key thing, because it could show that he is in hoc to who knows who in Russia. I mean, I don't want to get into too much detail of it, but I just want to ask quickly, could there be other impeachment articles at some point?
There always could. It depends on the details of what comes out.
Okay.
You can easily imagine things that could come out in the Trump Organization's business records, for example, that would just be unquestionably, and we can, as a matter of legal procedure, we can impeach him every week. But I just want to say, I moved ahead.
Believe me, I don't mean to. I feel the frustration everybody feels here, but the New York Times just endorsed 2 people in the primary, Elizabeth Warren and Senator Klobuchar. And I thought, and they were so honest about this. They said, we totally understand where both these people are coming from, even though they don't come from different worlds. And frankly, I see that here. Okay, and because on the one hand, there is an impatience, there is this need to stand up for the most basic principles, the Green New Deal, impeach Trump for everything he's ever done wrong, just get on with it. But there's the other argument, and that says, and that's Elizabeth Warren, a little bit more, not so much, but more. And then the argument says, living in the real world, you have to get votes on something. You have to bring the American people behind you. You have to count. And frankly, which way is the better way? The New York Times threw up his hands. I don't agree with what they did. They threw up their hands and said, we're going to endorse two people and stay out of this fight.
And I agree with you. I think, though, the way you get that support is you lead by example. And you lead by what is important to people. And it's not AIs, right? It's at the end of the day, how do I pay my electric bill?
So let me ask you this then. So much of what you want to do has to do with whether or not you can get stuff done. And I think your belief is you can. We really don't know much about your background. Can you talk a little bit about more what you've done and things that you've actually accomplished that show your ability to build consensus? And
So when I ran for the Will County Board, a little bit of background on that is I ran against the party's wishes. So after I ran for Joliet City Council, and I had a very good showing. It's my first time in the political world. And I went to the party and I asked them, hey, we have a Republican sitting in the Will County seat that I live in. I'd like to run for the seat. And they said, oh, no, you need to wait your time. And, we have people in mind who are more experienced. And I said, great, tell me about these people and maybe I'll help them out. And when they basically told me, well, there are people who did political favors for us, so it's their turn to run for office. And I said, well, that's not going to fly in my book. It's the voters who need to make that decision. And so I got out there and I was a top vote getter in the primary, and the party worked against me on that. And so when I got into office, I had an uphill battle with leadership. What you're seeing in the House with AOC and Nancy Pelosi is very reminiscent to what is happening on the Will County Board. And even with that being said, I had some huge successes. So right off the bat, I reached across the aisle with my so the Republican won the other seat, to help the people of Fairmont. So
Is this a water issue?
Yes, this is a water issue. So the township was trying to sell off their infrastructure to Aqua, which I don't know if you guys are familiar with, is being sued by the state because of the lead poisoning. And I don't believe that our resources like that should be privatized. And so I was able to get the Republican to also say, yeah, we need a better solution here. And so we worked together to get an intergovernment agreement from 4 different levels of government in order to not privatize their water, but to get the infrastructure improvements they need and keep it public water. And they're getting water now from Joliet. So that happened in the first few months of me working on the board. This is a 15-year problem that this township has had, and we were able to fix it in a few months. We've worked together across the aisle on some other issues too. One of the Republicans I'm working with right now is creating a local food economy for Will County, because we have food deserts and then we have farmers. They want to get out of the soybean and corn because of the trade wars, but there isn't money for growing local vegetables. So our subsidies just don't go there. So we're creating a demand and supply and demand right there. And because the Republican is in a farm area, she's very motivated to create this. And I'm motivated to get people accessible food. 2 other things that I did was I pushed our county to adopt the Greenest Region Compact. This is a framework
What compact?
the Greenest Region Compact. It's much like the Green New Deal. It's a framework for how you can go about a sustainable planet. It talks about water and energy and open lands. It's got 10 areas in it. And this was not popular among the Democratic Party. And so I was able to work with the Mayor's Caucus of Chicago. I was able to work with Wickerson, which is the Will County Regional Sustainability Network, to come in and give presentations. And I was able to work with our energy staff, our land use staff, to say, why is this important and where can we go with this and what kind of grants are available to Will County if we adopt this. We were the 2nd county in the entire state to adopt this. And I had to get both Republican and Democratic buy-in to get this passed. That happened 6 months of me on the job. And then since then, I'm currently creating new zoning policies on our land use because we have a need there. I created an agritourism liquor license so that we could have events and tourism in our area to bring in more tax dollars. And I went against my party when we voted for the gas tax. Not because I don't believe that trucks and warehouses should be paying their fair share, but because I asked the party to have a decrease on their highway levy so that the amount of money they'd be paying at homeowners would be paying at the pump, they would get back on their taxes at the end of the day. That way it wouldn't unfairly hurt the homeowners who are already being gouged by our state property taxes. The rest of the Democratic Party ummed and awed about it and decided that, we'll look at that in the future. And I said, no, this is a deal breaker for me. And I was the one Democrat who voted no against it because I do believe that we need to help people at the end of the day make sure they can pay their bills. So there are things that I've pushed for. There's things I'll continue to push for. We got the capital bill passed mostly because I was an advocate for the Democrats who fought the Republicans on making sure that we had open space expansions, that we put money in our forest preserves so that we could sequester carbon the correct way, the way that most scientists agree is the only official way that actually works right now, and that's through trees and our longleaf and our prairie grasses and soil, healthy soil. And that's where we really need to be going as a country when we look at these things. And so at the local level, from day one, I was able to work both with my party, who was not happy with me, who remains unhappy with me, and I was able to work across the aisle.
Well, first, I'm very proud of my environmental record. I'm proud to be the only candidate endorsed by the Sierra Club in this election.
I'm is kind of what's going on here, that we're seeing it playing out in this race, what we see so often now, which is impatient younger candidates up against people who have a different, more incremental approach.
Yeah, I think, it's true that elected officials live in the real world. I'm very proud that all the elected officials, including all the Democrats on the Will County Board who have endorsed me. All right, and that I think it's very telling that all of the local officials, that are senators, members of all who have endorsed me, because they understand that I am a reasonable voice for achievable policy things. There's someone that they go to for advice on what makes sense economically, politically, and that they respect my voting record as a very progressive and effective voting record.
There are a lot of our elected officials who have not endorsed Bill Foster. That's just the fact of it. And I just told you why. I mean, the Will County Democrats, yeah, they're upset I didn't play by the rules. And I'm not going to play by those rules because it's corruption.
I'm guessing that the incumbent probably does have many more endorsements, but you have some too. What are they?
Yeah, so Brand New Congress, Matriarch, Our Revolution, those are all national, and so is the Blue America, those are national endorsements. Chicago Sunrise Hub has endorsed me, and then we do have many local leaders, and more than that, I have dozens of individuals who have gone out there and talked about the things that I have done. And at the end of the day, that's what we need. We don't need bought and paper politicians. We need people who are going to be a voice of the people.
We could talk all day, but it's going to be sort of the same conversation with different issues. Mm-hmm. That's how this works. And I bet you guys have been through this. And I know you can feel frustrated because these conversations, it's never as full as you want it to be. But we're running up against an hour. I want to make sure that before we end this, that you both feel that you got a chance to say anything that we didn't ask you about that hasn't come up, so you're not driving home after this and saying, no, I really want to talk about this, but they didn't ask. Why don't we start with you first?
Yeah, so I think, some of this is, as you talked about, the impatience. We don't have time, right? We're looking at 11 hours. By the time I get sworn into Congress, we'll have 10 years left on the clock to do some real change to reverse the effects of climate crisis. So my generation and the generations that come after me are looking at this and saying, we don't have time. We need to be urgent in these things. And in the meantime, people are suffering both from the climate effects, from the healthcare choices that are being made, and all the other greed that we're seeing in this country. And it is the job of our Congress to set policies that are fair for everybody. And we don't have fair policies right now. We have a political system that absolutely rewards the rich and it penalizes the poor. And we need to move away from that. And when Foster first ran in 2008, he was big on the deficit, saying, how much money do we spend on our interest, on our debt? But yet, under his watch, and yes, some of these votes have increased that. We're at $22 trillion is our deficit right now. Our GDP is only $21 trillion. We pay almost $600 billion in interest every single year. So what could solve that? Definitely a wealth tax could solve that. The year I was born in 1981, we had a 70% marginal tax rate. We have not seen that since then. He talked about 85% marginal tax rate. We're seeing a country where the rich is not paying their fair share, and the poor continues to carry those burdens. And then we are penalized when we get on programs because we can't make things work.
The deficit trillions, and I think most observers would put that on Republicans. We'd put it on the Trump tax cut. And where the Republicans, the great guardians of the budget and fiscal
right.
responsibility, throw it out the windows. And if I remember at the time, Democrats were not thrilled at all about this. But if the choice was to this or to cut, the only things Republicans would allow them to cut would be social welfare services, right. Money for schools, money for those kinds of programs. It wasn't going to happen.
Right. So, but the problem with that argument is Foster sitting next to me voted for an increase in national spending to the tune of $22 billion just a few months ago. So it's not just the Republicans' fault. We have to rein in our military
I think my
spending.
point was they also voted in many cases for that kind of spending previously, but the choice was not to. The choice of voting against the budget was not going to reduce the budget. It would have been, the next step would have been just simply cutting the kind of programs that Democrats hold dear. I mean, and they voted for a
So
budget
you're saying that if he
included
would
a
have
lot of
voted
things that
no?
they felt were important.
So you're saying if he would have voted no on the national defense, they would have turned around and cut social programs?
I'm saying that budget included a lot of things that Democrats traditionally value, such as funding for national
Right.
public radio.
Well, okay,
and-
for the
and
general
paid family
budget, yeah,
leave.
but not
Millions
for
of
the national
Americans got-
defense budget. There was no reason for him to vote $22 billion on
The
that.
NDA had paid family leave for millions of Americans. This is something that Democrats have been fighting for decades. And so, these big deals that happen at the end, like passage of the NDA, that they're an example of something where you have to look at how it nets out for priorities. And, things like that I think were important to me, and I would vote for the NDA again.
Is
I
there
think a
any last
lot.
point you want to make beyond this then? Because we actually are out of time.
Okay.
Yeah, no, I mean, I was going to say that,
Is
we need to roll back our national, our nuke arsenal. We need to stop funding endless wars, and we need to reprioritize those dollars. So instead of spending them on defense contracts, because as a military spouse, I've seen even when Obama was in office and they cut spending on military defense, they cut it on the service members. They cut it on the gates and the commissaries and stuff like that. They didn't cut it on the contracts to Lockheed Martin or to Northrop Grumman, who are people who give money to Mr. Foster. So when we're looking at our priorities, we need to make sure that we're prioritizing people, education, jobs, the planet, right? Things that affect us on our day in and day out. These are the kitchen table problems, and this is why I think Mr. Foster is out of touch with the real issues, because these are things that I live every single day, and the thousands of people in my district live this every single day.
Okay, and your final point, and could you address the issue of you're getting donations from the kind of groups that are pro-military budget?
I'd have to go look through them. They certainly have not affected my vote on this. I'm a big fan of federally funded elections. I voted for H.R. 1 as the first vote in this section of Congress that basically had federally funded elections. I think that's where we should go, along with most modern democracies. On the other hand, in my career, I've been subject to as much as $7 million of spending against me by Republicans, most of it federal PAC money, when I race against Judy Biggert. Mm-hmm. And so you simply can't survive. My attitude on this is I'll put down my gun when they put down theirs. That what we should do is move toward federally funded elections. Until then, we have to. I'm very proud, though, actually. If you look at, there are all these interest groups that say which politicians in the pocket of which industry, and when they look at my contributors, they say, this is incredible. Bill Foster raises more money from scientists and academics than any member of Congress by far, and any senator except for Liz Warren and Chuck Schumer. And so if if you think that I'm in the pocket, deep in the pocket of the scientific truth lobby, I guess I'll plead guilty.
So that was actually a response to her point. Is there any last point you want to make? Because
just that there is a unique, there's a need for better scientific competence. If you look at the threat of Amazon, that one of the big problems, if you go and visit the Amazon facility down in Will County, that's almost completely robotic. There's one job that's left, the so-called product picker. And guess what? If you Google Amazon Picking Challenge, they are sponsoring a robotics competition to replace that last job in the warehouses. Okay, and so the issue is not going to be working conditions in the warehouses. They're going to be whether there are any humans in the warehouses at all. All right, and this, unless Congress gets ahead of the curve on technological job displacement, it is not a small issue, and it is going to, hit our whole economy. It's going to require a restructure of our economy, a big part of which will be to increase tax rates on the very wealthiest, and use that to make life easier for those who are less able to compete against machines and for the And this is
Listen,
that's a.
Thanks for coming in.
Yep.
This is fascinating. I'm
Those-
lucky.
those
We
are the
just-
amounts
It's like
for
going to
the-
grad school, these meetings.
For the military spending, and his number one issue, number one contributor is actually the financial banks, and he sits on financial services.
All right, thanks.
Thank you guys for coming.